I've decided to critique this following article here called What is a Regulated Militia? No less than Alexander Hamilton defined it for us by Brett Arends. And please excuse me if I mispronounced your name, not intentional. Okay, so essentially I'm going to be reading some of his comments. I believe I'm doing a good job, I'm not, won't be quoting anything out of context. Everything he's stated uh, are without omission ellipses. I'm basically going from beginning to end of various paragraphs of his editorial, of his opinion. And I'm going to be using a slightly different voice when I read his stuff. Please don't take that to mean that I'm making fun of him. I'm just doing it so you can tell the difference between what I'm saying and what he's saying. So, to begin, before I go any further, let me say that I am not anti-gun, nor do I want guns banned. I am opposed to the extremists on both sides of this debate. I've taken gun safety courses. I grew up in a house with guns, and I know gun enthusiasts personally, and I agree with them on plenty of points. Yeah, that kind of comes across as well, I have black friends. Uh, so kind of sets the stage here. As we all know, one of the habits of most extreme gun promoters is to focus on the final 14 words and leave out the rest. Convenient, that. I'm going to bet that according to him that none of us are actually in the militia. I hope this guy doesn't think this is somehow an original argument. The most extreme gun promoters are fond of quoting George Mason, a Virginia delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, who described a militia as, quote, the whole people except for a few public officials. Once again, they leave out the important bits. This was only Mason's opinion. He was defining only a quote unquote militia, not a quote unquote well regulated one. It wasn't just Mason. And the author is reading concepts into the idea of well regulated that aren't there. Some other people who had opinions on what a militia is. A well regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained in arms is the best and most natural defense of a free country. James Madison. Not talking about a select group of people, but the whole body of people. Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? Is it feared, then, that we shall turn our arms each man against his own bosom? Congress have no power to disarm the militia. Their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. This is Tench Coxe, who was a relatively famous statesman of his time in state legislatures and also very active in the debates surrounding the Constitution. Militias, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves and include all men capable of bearing arms. To preserve liberty, it's essential that in the whole body of the people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially young, when how to use them. Richard Henry Lee. The militia is our ultimate safety. We can have no security without it. The great object is that every man be armed. Patrick Henry. So the George Mason having one opinion that doesn't fit in somehow being an outsider doesn't fit at all. Actually, he, George Mason, was such a political outlier that he was one of only 3 delegates who refused to sign the new Constitution. Uh, that's wholly incorrect. Of the people who did not sign the Constitution, and there are actually more than this list. These are people who actually gave reasons for why they refused to sign the Constitution. There are many others who just either refused to show up for the convention altogether or left in the middle without explaining why. Of these people, William Houston, Nathaniel Pendleton, Luther Martin, John Mercer, Elbridge Gerry, Caleb Strong, John Lansing, Robert Yates, Edmund Randolph, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. George Mason, the outlier our author wants to talk about, refuses to sign the Constitution because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Kind of interesting that our author is talking about an amendment from the Bill of Rights and chastising one of the people who didn't sign it because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. What many people fail to understand is the Constitution, although primarily written by the Federalists, is a product of both Federalist and Anti-Federalist thought, because the Federalists realized they would have to somehow win over the Anti-Federalists in order to get them into their camp. Ultimately, the original Constitution had no Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was not written until after the Constitution was ratified and the first Congress was in session. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the first Congress decided to write the Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, we don't have to wonder what the Founding Fathers meant by quote-unquote well-regulated militia, because one of the leading architects of the new republic, Alexander Hamilton, defined it for us in the Federalist Papers. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting way of putting it. So let's talk about Alexander Hamilton's contributions to the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton wanted senators to have lifetime appointments, meaning that they would be like Supreme Court judges, where they would sit in office unless they were forcibly removed by impeachment or until they were dead. He also believed the president should also be appointed for life under the same circumstances. Essentially, he would remain in office until forcibly removed or dead. The Senate alone, with Hamilton, would have the power to declare war. The other house, what would we end up calling the House of Representatives, what he called the Assembly, would have no say-so. He also wanted the governor of each state to be appointed by the federal government. He believed that no state should have any forces, land or naval whatsoever, and that the militia of all the states were to be under the sole and exclusive direction of the United States government. None of these ideas were implemented. What ideas he did have that showed up in the Constitution were things that were promoted by other individuals. So Alexander's architecture didn't have much impact. Alexander Hamilton defined it for us in the Federalist Paper, which paved the way for the Constitutional Convention. Well, sorry to tell you this, but the convention came first. The Federalist Papers came second, because in order for the document to be ratified, each individual state had to ratify it. The Federalist Papers were a series of editorials and articles in newspapers trying to convince people that the Constitution was something worth having. Hamilton's views on the Constitution are a bit problematic. As I mentioned about his ideas on how the Constitution should be set up, he believed the government should be massively centralized. A lot of evidence exists that he didn't feel remotely bound by the Constitution, that it was merely a stepping stone to making government more centralized, which casts a lot of what he says in doubt. But since he was the most prolific writer of the Federalists in the Federalist Papers, we have to take a lot of what he says as, something. It's something that has to be contended with. It can't be ignored. Hamilton had his report on manufactures when he was Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury. He suggested massive government invention by way of targeted subsidies and the creation of a government-chartered manufacturing corporation. Madison, the kind of real architect of the Constitution, asked Hamilton where such powers arose in the Constitution. Hamilton stated that the General Welfare Clause gave the government the power. Madison would disagree on that. Hamilton's ideas on expanding the federal government became so out of line with the shared ideas on constitutional thought that it created a rift that created the first political parties to form. Most notably, it caused Madison, who was adamantly against political parties, not only to form a party, but to form one in opposition to Hamilton. In Federalist number 29, Hamilton explained at great length precisely what a well-regulated militia was. And my thought on that. So, basically, to pull from Federalist 29, which Hamilton wrote under a pseudonym at the time, he said to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. He also stated, it being therefore evident that the supposition of a want of power to require the aid of the posse comitatus is entirely destitute of color, it will follow that the conclusion which has been drawn from it in its application to the authority of the federal government over the militia is as uncandid as it is illogical. What reason could there be to infer that force was intended to be the sole instrument of authority merely because there is a power to make use of it when necessary? Essentially, Hamilton's talking about the idea of posses, which it's a pretty deep topic I don't want to get into, but the gist of it he was saying was the existence of an organization, be it through common law or be it through tradition in the United States, didn't need to be spelled out specifically in the Constitution for it to continue to be an existing function. Continuing with Hamilton from Federalist 29, the prospect of disciplining all the militia of the United States is as futile as it would be injurious. If it were capable of being carried into execution, a tolerable expertness in military movements is a business that requires time and practice. It is not a day or even a week that will suffice for the attainment of it. To oblige a great body of the yeomanry and the other classes of citizens to be under arms for the purposes of going through military exercises and evolutions as often as might be necessary to acquire a degree of perfection which would entitle them to a character of a well-regulated militia. So he is not okay. First, what he's trying to say there is if we try to train everybody up to the standards he thinks they need to be trained up to, nothing's ever going to get done because everyone's going to be too deeply into basically training for the militia. So he's hoping for this select group. But his use of the term well-regulated militia uh, does not have a specific meaning, as we talked about with some of the other architects of our country, talking about using the same usage, but using it to mean everybody. So, yes, he is using it in the way that the author of the opinion piece says, but he seems to be one of the only ones using it that way, and it's really not particularly credible to say that his use of well-regulated militia is the same concept that's being spelled out in the Second Amendment. Again, going back to James Madison, a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained in arms is the best, most natural defense of a free country. Now, the interesting depiction here in this plate, this is the War of 1812, after Madison has been, essentially after Madison and the army have been pushed out of Washington, D.C. Here he is directing the troops, which are a mix of soldiers, possibly some form of active militia and irregular militia, all mixed together working on the battlefield. Hamilton defined it basically as what today we call the National Guard. Again, I hope he doesn't believe he's coming up with original arguments. So, what the author here wants us to believe that everybody in the 1790s understood the Second Amendment to be creating a National Guard. Yet, no such entity, and I'm not just talking the name, I'm talking the actual way it is set up and the way it's interpreted lawfully. No such entity was created until well after the Civil War. Until after before the Civil War, the primary military cadre was the state militia, which for the most part organized and drilled at the township level. This also included privately funded militias. War of 1812, the U.S. Army fled Washington, D.C., and finally stopped to make a stand only once it had been bulked up with irregular militias. Once again, this is a painting depicting the War of 1812 outside of Washington, D.C. The person standing there in command is once again President James Madison, standing in with the troops, actually under fire, one of the few presidents to actually experience that as president. During the Civil War, the first units to show up in Washington, D.C. were state and private militias. State and private militias arrived from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. within 72 hours of Lincoln raising the militia. The Battle of Bull Run was fought primarily with militias. Do you think our author would condone private militias, as did every administration from George Washington, probably through Ulysses S. Grant? Clearly, it was a part of the understanding of our militia system of that time. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is Hamilton didn't write this. Hamilton was nowhere near to be writing this. Hamilton was adamantly against the Bill of Rights. I'm going to give a quick excerpt on Hamilton being against the Bill of Rights and explaining his reasoning why. And his reasons aren't all that far off. It's not like he was being crazy about it. It was a logical way to look at things. Hamilton's quote, For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? Why, for instance, shall it be said that the liberty of the press shall not be restrained, when no power is given by which the restriction may be imposed? To understand the Bill of Rights, as I was mentioning before, there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution as it was ratified. The Federalists were pretty much against it. They did not want any such thing put in there for the reasons that Hamilton suggested. Federalists were of a like mind. However, there is a article of the Constitution called the Convention of States. And essentially, the Anti-Federalists were not happy with the lack of a Bill of Rights, amongst a bunch of other issues. And so, when the Constitution was in place, the Anti-Federalists were agitating to form a Convention of States. Madison was so frightened by the idea of this happening that he decided he needed to push for adding a Bill of Rights to basically diffuse the movement, because he feared that the Anti-Federalists might sit down, form a convention, and write an entirely new constitution. So the verbiage of the Bill of Rights is meant to mollify the Anti-Federalists who are threatening to convene the Convention of States. The Anti-Federalists did not want a nationalized militia. The language written by the Federalists to the Anti-Federalists is to assure them that certain charges that they made about the new Constitution were untrue. Thus, the words of the Bill of Rights need to be read as the Anti-Federalists would have interpreted them, because they were written specifically for them, for the political purposes of diffusing their distrust and activism. So, going back to the author's reasoning, the well-regulated militia in this statement would be under the sole control of government. Okay? So basically he's saying the well-regulated militia is a government entity. It's like the National Guard. So, this government-controlled organization shall not be infringed upon. How does the government infringe upon a government organization? The Bill of Rights solely exists to reinforce the powers the federal government does not have. However, the author in this instance wants us to believe that a document written to allay the fears of the Anti-Federalists inserted a clause to protect an elite, well-regulated portion of the militia as a national construct. And this national construct was to be protected by infringements by who? The states? The people themselves, who the right to bear arms is in the first part of this amendment for? Sorry, I don't find his arguments remotely compelling. Well, what do you think of these arguments the author has made? Please consider looking at the original articles. You can see that I did not pull his paragraphs out of context. If you have any additional thoughts on that, I'd be interested to see them in the comments. Please smash the like button. If you've come upon this video and you're not a regular subscriber, consider subscribing. You can take a look at my list of videos. I comment on a lot of different subjects. And if you think there's somebody who might find this video interesting, please consider sharing it with them. Well, I appreciate you spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.